Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and today we're looking at some more Final Fantasy XIV news. So there's been a couple of articles coming out with several of the developers from the Final Fantasy XIV team. There was one with Osmo where he talks about the design of Savage and, specifically P10 and how they worked extra hard on Pandemonium and maybe overdid it a bit. But then there was this interview yesterday. Final Fantasy XIV's toughest dungeons are here to stay if players want them. Now, this entire thing is about Variant and Criterion dungeons and features the developers that worked on this particular feature. This article over on Inverse starts with the release of 6.25, 14 introduced a wildly popular new feature, Variant and Criterion Dungeons. Variant dungeons are designed around choice and replayability, focusing on puzzles and branching paths in addition to battle content. Criterion dungeons are visually similar but incredibly difficult, on par with Extreme Trials or Savage Raids. With two Variant and Criterion dungeons now available in 14, the feature seems to be a hit with the player base. So you could tell that whoever wrote this doesn't fully grasp how much of a quote hit they are, because if you haven't been paying attention, Variant's been relatively well received, but the problem being that unless you want to farm the items for Gil, afterwards there's not a whole lot of incentive to do it. There's no like Variant roulette of any kind. There's not really sufficient enough like tomes or anything. There's nothing to get players in there, and most players just solo through the paths and finish the story and never do it again. That's fine. Not everything needs to be ultra replayable, but it'd be nice if there was some more longevity. Criterion, on the other hand, more experienced raiders are really enjoying, but they find there's not enough incentive. So I'd say more like we love what we're seeing, but it's plagued by another issue that we wish wasn't an issue and was better preserved. It's been kind of a common theme throughout Endwalker as a whole. Feedback we've received has been positive overall, says the battle content designer Masatoshi Ishikawa. There we go. Oof, can't do that at 9:30 in the morning. Especially relieved to see many players welcome the concept of Variant dungeons, which involve smaller groups and plenty of puzzle solving. Yeah, those have been great, especially day one, right as the patch releases. Following the release of 6.45 and FanFest in July, Inward spoke with Ishikawa and Endwalker and Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker Assistant Director Tsuyoshi Yokozawa about the design and philosophy behind Variant and Criterion dungeons. They also offered some intriguing hints about how these challenges might evolve in the future. So this article has some stuff. I already know that this has some stuff that's definitely worth acknowledging and talking about, especially if you're like me and you want these things to stick around, but you want them to be better. So let's take a look. What has the player reception been like? How has that reception shaped your future plans? Moving forward, I'd like to keep what was well received while improving on the aspects that were inconvenient. Beginning at 6.4, the party list shows which variant actions your party members have equipped, which came about from that line of thinking. I honestly forgot about that, but yeah, no, that was a good thing. Criterion dungeons were our first high-end content for smaller groups. We received a lot of positive feedback from players who enjoyed tackling them with a party of friends. That said, the difficulty of Criterion dungeons is comparable to an 8-player Savage Raid, if not harder. So there were also comments that felt the current rewards aren't motivating enough to attempt the content. Finally, we get to see a developer. Somebody acknowledge it. We've been yelling it for like a year now since the first one, and now with the second one, like, please, it needs better rewards. It's so much fun. I want to see more people do it. I want to see more people enjoy it. But there's not a good enough reason. Maybe do it once and then Savage especially. Like, it's just not enough reason to do Criterion Savage unless you want that acknowledgement of having beaten it. The rewards need to be determined very carefully in relation to rewards for other content, but we will continue deliberating on the idea to satisfy as many players as possible. Upgrade mats. Just put an upgrade mat in there. Just put something. Anything. You don't deliberate too much. You just give it. If you said it yourself, they're comparable to 8-player Savage Raids. The answer's right there in front of you. There's no more deliberating that needs to happen. So that's there, acknowledging it, which hopefully means some sort of reasonable change. Now, do I think that change will come in 6.5? No. 6.51 is going to have the final variant and Criterion. I don't think this is going to be reflected in that at all. I think this is like a 7.x. We already know Variant and Criterion. Well, at the very least, Variant is planned for 7.x. I wouldn't expect the changes to come into effect any sooner than that. But honestly, they could go buck wild in 5.1. I just don't think they will. With the varying difficulty and branching paths, How much work does it take to get things right? How long are they typically in development? We follow our usual thought process for 4-player dungeons, but have to remember that the players could have fewer players that lack certain roles, speaking specifically on variant. They're meant to feel like typical 4-player dungeons with any party composition. We built a new system where all 3 roles are weighed equally, and the difficulty only changes based on the number of participants. Began development somewhere between 1 to 1.5 patches earlier than usual in order to build the new system. It's branching paths. That's actually a pretty short turnover if you think about it. Like that's a pretty solid turnover for a whole new game system. Now obviously it's built on top of what is the core gameplay of 14, so it's not like everything needs to be done from the ground up. But that's actually impressive to hear. I figured it would have been in development way earlier than a patch or a patch and a half before. Building the new system was a one-off task, but future variant dungeons still have to be balanced for 1 to 4. They still require a lot more work than a standard 4-player dungeon. The difference is especially apparent with background design, since the additional paths directly translate to more work to be done. Yeah, and that's kind of why people love variant dungeons anyway, because of all the paths and the different regions and how the enemies in that area are reflected and the lore. Like, that's why people want them to be more prominent in a repeatable activity, something that's a little more rewarding outside of wanting to sell a bunch of stuff on the market board, which sells really well because nobody wants to do it. How do you design the bosses for variant Criterion? How is it different from the boss design in standard dungeons? Honestly, the boss design in the dungeons is, like, in a lot of ways better than their 8-man boss design. Like, I genuinely feel like the 4-player bosses, while posing a near identical challenge, are far more creative than a lot of the 8-player ones. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still a lot of stack, spread, in, out, left, right. Like, you get all the classics, but the thematics of the boss feel like they're far more in check. That's especially evident in places like the first Criterion boss ever, the hamster, Silky, with the washing of the brooms and how you could affect them by aiming AoEs and whatnot. It led to a lot of really interesting theory crafting. You have the tower placements in the second boss in Mount Rockon. They do a really good job of getting the 4 players to interact with the boss in the arena. It's something that I feel like they feel maybe more restricted on when the parties are larger. Designing bosses for variant and regular dungeons involves the same overall process. Provide the boss's lore, use it to rough out the concept, brainstorm the main mechanics. The main difference with variant dungeons are planning out branching paths and their associated mechanics, as well as creating mechanics that can be resolved regardless of party size. Bosses are usually designed with only their lore in mind, so creating battle mechanics that were indirectly related to the boss, like turning a dial switch located elsewhere in the dungeon, proved to be a challenge for many of our staff. Yeah, that sounds like something that 14 as a whole, not the development team, but actually like the game and the systems and the engine would struggle with. You flip a dial. I'd imagine what actually happens is the boss just straight up changes. Like, it probably, if you could be in range of it during these things happening, it would probably like do the thing where like the little shadow appears under it, and it's like the spawning animation. But they keep it far enough away that you don't get to see that. So a lot of the times it just looks like, it just seems like the boss has changed mechanically. Let's see. Solo, we couldn't use mechanics that require multiple players to stack together or spread out for targeted. Wow, they really struggle not doing spread stacks. That's so funny. Criterion bosses are more evenly challenged. I like how one of the biggest difficulties is like, well, we don't know, we can't make them spread or stack when there's only one of them, so what do we do? Somewhat similar to designing 8-player raids in that we're creating 2 separate difficulties, but variant dungeons are about as hard as 4-player dungeons, whereas Criterion dungeons are equivalent to Savage. So the difficulty gap between normal and Savage raids pale in comparison. Creating bosses for Criterion dungeons required staff members who could not only retool variant dungeon mechanics and resources for high-end content, but also keep the necessary development resources under control. That's all fair. That's all, development talk. Notable aspect for Criterion dungeons, or more accurately, the difference between 4 and 8-player content and how there's only 1 tank and 1 healer, and individual DPS players have more responsibility. No tank swaps meant more emphasis on positioning enemies or having tanks stand in front of the party. The healer could be a pure or barrier healer, so you had to design more mechanics rather than incoming damage. Yeah, there is a lot of that. I mean, it's an interesting thing to talk about, the lack of locking your healer away, or if you are going to lock your healer away for like a mechanic, like how your party has to respond to that. What is the time frame of that? What is the DPS check for that? What is the tank's role in that moment? Is it just to protect them? Is it to make sure that they don't take damage while the healers, like anything they do has to be weighed against that. But I think that might be why the bosses at times feel more creative because they can't do what we consider to be the single most standard things that we've just come to expect from 8-player Savage bosses. So instead, how the tank interacts with the party and how the healer interacts with the party functionally has to change. Now, they still do stack, spread, all that stuff. They still do it, but a lot of the times there's a bit more nuance to it and how the space is used. And with only 4 players, making the space that's usable smaller. That was true in the first Criterion and the second Criterion. The amount of space you have to do a stack or spread is made a lot smaller, which honestly is kind of nerve-wracking. It makes some of the movement a little scarier, some of the uptime strategies a little bit scarier. So there are a lot of little things that change just from that one bit. Furthermore, we had to place a restriction on raises to avoid disparity between DPS jobs with and without the raise. With all that said, there are also advantages. Designing mechanics that require determining party member priority, giving each player an equal amount of responsibility, was easier with smaller party size. Yeah, perfectly reasonable thing to do there as well. Do you have any plans to evolve or change the formula? Can we expect variant Criterion to stick around through 7.x? And have you thought about how the new jobs might work in the previous dungeons? We don't have plans to change their fundamental formula at the moment, but as we release more variant dungeons, we might find something we're lacking or can improve, and we'd like to address that with flexibility. Of course, we plan on having new jobs coming with the next expansion be fully playable in variant Criterion, just as we've done with deep dungeons and other content. As for the future of the dungeons in 7.0 and beyond, it'll depend on the feedback we receive from our players. For now, we'd like to hear your thoughts and comments after playing through Mount Rockon and the 3rd dungeon, which is currently in development. Oh yeah, and look, now at the bottom I noticed anywhere it says it will launch on Xbox in 2024. Got to give that quick little acknowledgement. So it's nice to actually hear from the people who are working on it, developing it, what their interpretation is, what feedback they've received. One of the biggest struggles we sometimes have with Final Fantasy XIV is we don't really fully know until the change is made when feedback is heard. We either get that information from Yoshi P in a live letter or through something like this. So whenever we can get that acknowledgement, it's something that matters a lot to those of us who are playing, especially when it involves content that we are actively participating in. So I'm glad to hear that they've seen the problems with the reward structure and they're acknowledging them and they're trying to weigh what their options are. But I think less thinking, more look at your own words and just emulate that. Would it be cool to get a whole new armor set? Sure. Am I expecting that? No. Something that upgrades our gear, something that just lets us progress our character through a means that isn't 8-player Savage. Smaller means of getting your character stronger, of gearing up multiple jobs. Utilize the systems that you have and use them to just engage with the player base more and to make your player base engage with your content more. It's been the single biggest problem in Endwalker, and there's almost no better example than Criterion and Criterion Savage, and even Variant to some capacity, but that's still a little bit better. But anyway, that is the interview from Inworse. Be sure to check it in the description of the video. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned. We've got a live letter coming up. We've got a fan fest coming up. We've got patch 6.5 and 6.51 coming up, and that's going to have to be my main thing tiding me over until Rebirth, because now with that, I don't know what news to pay attention to more, because I'm just addicted to all the Final Fantasy news now. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you on the next one. And until then, take care.